Hello, second grade Smarties, and welcome to Wit and Wisdom Module 3 Civil Rights Heroes, Lesson 21. Today, our content framing question, or the pizza bite question for today, is what does a deeper understanding of dialogue reveal about the story of Ruby Bridges? So, we are going to be talking about dialogue. So, a dialogue in a text is a conversation that happens between two or more characters. So, if I am reading a dialogue, that means I'm reading a conversation between characters in a text. So, I am going to read a page from the text, and I want you to think about the dialogue that might be happening between Mrs. Henry and Ruby. Sometimes I'd look at her and wonder how she did it, said Mrs. Henry, how she went by those mobs and sat here all by herself, and yet seemed so relaxed and comfortable. Mrs. Henry would question Ruby in order to find out if the girl was really nervous and afraid, even though she seemed so calm and confident. But Ruby kept saying she was doing fine. The teacher decided to wait and see if Ruby would keep on being so relaxed and hopeful, or if she'd gradually begin to wear down, or even decide that she no longer wanted to go to school. So, on this page in the text, we do not see a conversation happen between Ruby and Mrs. Henry. But I want you to think, looking at this page in the text, what do you think Mrs. Henry would be saying to Ruby in this setting? What is something that Mrs. Henry might say to Ruby in this setting? Tell me in the puzzle. So, something that I think Mrs. Henry would be saying is, Ruby, how are you so brave? Why do you keep coming to school? Why are you not afraid of the people outside? So, those are examples of things that Mrs. Henry could be saying in this section, right? The text doesn't tell us the conversation that these two characters are having, but we could probably put in our minds a conversation that is probably happening between Mrs. Henry and Ruby. So, we're thinking about Mrs. Henry's thoughts and feelings. What do you think Ruby would say back to Mrs. Henry? In this text, in this page of the text, Ruby isn't talking. But what do you think Ruby would be saying to Mrs. Henry? What is a sentence that Ruby would say to Mrs. Henry on this page? Tell me in the puzzle. So, something that I could see Ruby saying on this page is, I love to learn, and I am brave and want to keep trying my best. I also think Ruby would be saying, I'm wanting to make my parents proud, and I'm wanting to do the best that I can do. So, even though we do not see that dialogue or that conversation in the text, we can paint a movie in our head. We can play a movie in our head about what is happening between these characters. So, we are going to be exploring the dialogue. Dialogue is another word for what, Smarties? Conversation. We're going to be thinking about the dialogue and the points of view of Mrs. Henry and Ruby in a section of the text. Remember, rereading a text or rereading sections of a text give us a better understanding of what is happening with our characters, what is happening with the setting, the problem, the actions of the characters. So I'm going to be reading this page. And I want you to think about Mrs. Henry's point of view. What is she seeing? What is she thinking? What is she feeling? Then, one morning, something happened. Mrs. Henry stood by a window in her classroom as she usually did, watching Ruby walk toward the school. Suddenly, Ruby stopped, right in front of the mob of howling and screaming people. She stood there facing all those men and women. She seemed to be talking to them. What is Mrs. Henry seeing on this page? What is she seeing? Tell me in the puzzle. She sees Ruby from her classroom walking to the school. But she sees Ruby stop. She sees Ruby stop in front of the mob of people. So I want you to think, what is Mrs. Henry's point of view? Does she know what is happening with Ruby? Or is she only seeing what is happening to Ruby? She's only seeing it from the outside, right? Right now, she can only see what is happening. Does she know what Ruby is experiencing right now? No. Let's keep going to see if we can find out more about what is happening with these characters' points of view. Mrs. Henry saw Ruby's lips moving and wondered what Ruby could be saying. The crowd seemed ready to kill her. The marshals were frightened. They tried to persuade Ruby to move along. They tried to hurry her into the school, but Ruby wouldn't budge. Then Ruby stopped talking and walked into the school. So Mrs. Henry sees Ruby stop in the middle of the crowd. School time! She sees Ruby stop in the middle of the crowd, and she also sees Ruby's lips moving. Now I want you to think, we have read this text 2 times. What is really happening with Ruby? What is Ruby doing in this page? Is she talking to the crowd? Is she yelling back at them? What is Ruby really doing on this page of the text? Tell me in the puzzle. So we know that in a few pages, and we're going to be talking about those pages, but we know that Ruby is praying. She forgot to pray earlier as she was walking to the school. And so at this moment, she is praying for the people. She is praying to God for these people. All right. When she went into the classroom, Mrs. Henry asked her what happened. Mrs. Henry told Ruby that she'd been watching and that she was surprised when Ruby stopped and talked with the people in the mob. Ruby became irritated. "I didn't stop and talk with them," she said. "Ruby, I saw you talking," Mrs. Henry said. "I saw your lips moving." "I wasn't talking, Ruby," said Ruby. "I was praying. I was praying for them." Every morning, Ruby had stopped a few blocks away from the school to say a prayer for the people who hated her. This morning, she forgot until she was already in the middle of the angry mob. So, either the last lesson or a couple lessons ago, we talked about the word irritated. Ruby became irritated. The word irritated means to become a little upset, right? If you're irritated about something, you are upset and bothered by something. Who did Ruby get irritated with? Mrs. Henry. Why does Ruby feel irritated with Mrs. Henry? Why does she feel irritated with her? Tell me in the puzzle. So remember, we've talked about points of view. With our first text with Ruby Bridges goes to school, my true story, we get to see her perspective from her thoughts, her feelings, and her experiences. In this text, we see Mrs. Henry seeing something happening, but does she really know what is going on with Ruby? No. So think about it. Mrs. Henry is seeing what is going on, but she doesn't know what's going on. Imagine that you're on a playground and it looks like you have pushed someone on the ground. It looks like you have pushed someone on the ground. And your mom or dad or grown up that's with you sees it from far away and they say, "Hey, why did you push that person?" But what really happened was that person had tripped in a hole and fell. It looked like you pushed them, but you really didn't. Would you become irritated with that? Yeah, because it looks like one thing, but it's something completely different. We have to know what is happening before we just start saying things, right? It's always important to tell the truth and to know the whole story. So Mrs. Henry thinks that Ruby stopped and started talking to the people in the crowd. But we know that isn't the case. But before Mrs. Henry finds out about why Ruby stopped and talked in the middle of the crowd, why do you think Mrs. Henry would be surprised that Ruby stopped? Why do you think that would surprise Mrs. Henry that Ruby stopped in the middle of the crowd? Why would that surprise her? Tell me in the puzzle. So she was probably surprised because the people were hateful to Ruby, right? Mrs. Henry had seen Ruby just come into the school without saying or interacting with those people, but that was the first time that she stopped and started talking. That would be really surprising. That would be really shocking if you saw someone doing something a certain way for a long time and then they do something completely different. But also, Ruby could have gotten hurt, right? So Mrs. Henry was surprised. She didn't know, but what she saw was that she was surprised that Ruby would take such a risk. So on this page of the text, we see a dialogue between Mrs. Henry and Ruby. Remember, a dialogue is a conversation. So when we are reading a dialogue out loud, when we are reading a text or when we are reading a book, it's important to change our voices to let the listener know who is speaking. So when I'm talking like Ruby, I have my voice really high. When I'm talking like Mrs. Henry, I bring my voice down a little bit lower and a little bit slower. It lets you know who is talking in this text. So I want you to listen to this dialogue that's in the text. I didn't stop and talk with them. Ruby, I saw you talking. I saw your lips moving. I wasn't talking. I was praying. I was praying for them. How did that make that dialogue more interesting? What helped that dialogue be more interesting as a listener? How was that more helpful to you as a listener when I changed my voice? How did that help you? Tell me in the puzzle. So when I changed my voice, you knew who was talking. What if I read it like this? I didn't stop and talk with them. Ruby, I saw you talking. I saw your lips moving. I wasn't talking. I was praying. I was praying for them. Could you tell who was talking in that dialogue? No. So when we change the way our voice sounds for each character, it makes it more interesting for the listener, but it also lets the listener know who is talking in the conversation. So this dialogue between Ruby and Mrs. Henry gives us different perspectives, right? Mrs. Henry only saw what was happening, but Ruby was the one that knew what was happening. What does this dialogue between Mrs. Henry and Ruby tell us what Ruby is thinking and feeling? How is she feeling on this page? What was she doing? She was praying for them. What do you think she was thinking about and feeling as she was praying for those people? What do you think she was thinking or feeling? Tell me in the puzzle. I would think she was feeling hopeful. And I also think that she is being very forgiving and brave and praying in front of that crowd. So, Ruby knew what was happening, but Mrs. Henry could only see what was happening. Mrs. Henry saw Ruby in the crowd, and she thought Ruby was talking to the angry people. But what was really happening was that Ruby had stopped in the crowd, but she was praying and was asking God to forgive the angry people. How does this situation give us a different perspective about this event? Think about Mrs. Henry. She could only see what was happening, but Ruby knew in her heart what was going on. So, thinking about what Ruby knew in her heart and what she was thinking, we are going to be talking about how we can explode an event in our focusing question task number 4. So remember, we have talked about narratives. Those are stories. Those stories tell us about the scape, the setting, the characters, the action, problem, and ending. And we can explode moments by describing the thoughts, feelings, and actions of our characters. So what we are going to be doing is we are going to be exploding an event in the story of Ruby Bridges. So what you are going to be doing is you are going to be creating a scape chart. And you are going to be using the scape chart to help you organize your writing. Now, you are going to be writing in first person. So you are going to be writing again like you are Ruby Bridges. And there is a specific event that we're going to be looking at. We're going to be looking at the event when Ruby stopped in the crowd. So here is what I need you to do right now, Smarties. I need you to get a piece of paper out. And I need you to create a scape chart. So I need you to create a scape chart. So make a T in your paper. And you are going to put 1, 2, 3, 4 lines to separate your setting, character, action, problem, and ending. Okay, so I need you to go ahead and make that scape chart. And what we're going to be doing now is we are going to be looking at this event when Ruby stops in the middle of the angry mob and prays. We are going to be looking at the scape of this event. Mrs. Henry saw Ruby's lips moving and wondered what Ruby could be saying. The crowd seemed ready to kill her. The marshals were frightened. They tried to persuade Ruby to move along. They tried to hurry her into the school, but Ruby wouldn't budge. Then Ruby stopped talking and walked into the school. Pause. What is the setting that you are going to write in your scape chart? Go ahead and write the setting in your scape chart. So the setting is in front of the school building, right? She's not in the school yet, but she's in front of the school building. Now we're going to pause again. Now we're going to move into our characters of our scape chart. Who are the characters in this event? Go ahead and write your characters for this event. So our characters are the angry mob, Ruby, the marshals, and Mrs. Henry is seeing what is happening too. But Mrs. Henry isn't a big part of this. So really, we're focused on Ruby, the angry mob, and the marshals. When she went into the classroom, Mrs. Henry asked her what happened. Mrs. Henry told Ruby that she'd been watching and that she was surprised when Ruby stopped and talked with the people in the mob. Ruby became irritated. "I didn't stop and talk with them," she said. "Ruby, I saw you talking," Mrs. Henry said. "I saw your lips moving." "I wasn't talking," said Ruby. "I was praying. I was praying for them." Every morning, Ruby had stopped a few blocks away from school to say a prayer for the people who hated her. This morning, she forgot until she was already in the middle of the angry mob. When school was over for the day, Ruby hurried through the mob as usual. After she walked a few blocks and the crowd was behind her, Ruby said the prayer she repeated twice a day, before and after school. Please, God, try to forgive those people, because even if they say those bad things, they don't know what they're doing. So you could forgive them, just like you did those folks a long time ago when they said terrible things about you. All right, Smarties, so that is our event. So far in our scape chart, you have written the setting, the characters. What's going to come next? Our actions. So let's think about the actions of our characters. What is happening to the characters in this part? What is happening? What is Ruby doing? What did she do? What did Ruby do? What was her actions? Go ahead and write them in your scape chart. So Ruby stopped and prayed for the people. What were the angry people doing? What were the angry people doing? Write it in your scape chart. It says the crowd seemed ready to kill her. We could also look at the illustrations. The crowd is yelling at her. They're pushing towards her. What are the marshals doing on this page? The marshals were frightened. They tried to persuade Ruby to move along. They tried to hurry her into school, but Ruby wouldn't budge. What were the marshals doing? Write it in your scape chart. So those are the actions. What is the problem? What is the problem? Write the problem in your scape chart. Those people still didn't want Ruby to come to that school. She'd been coming for a long time. They were mean to her. And what does Ruby do? In the end, what does Ruby do? Go ahead and write it in your scape chart. She prays for the people. So let's check your scape chart, okay? Get your scape chart, and we're going to check it right now, okay? So on your scape chart, you should have France Elementary School as your setting. For our characters, now, Mrs. Henry is on here, but we are just talking about that event of her stopping in the crowd. So I would have Ruby. You can keep Mrs. Henry, but I would also put the marshals and the angry mob. The problem is that some people did not want Ruby to go to the school, and they were mean to her. The actions is that Ruby stopped in the middle of the crowd. People were yelling at her. The marshals were trying to rush her, but she would not move. In the end, we learned that Ruby is praying for the people who are mean. So there's our scape chart. But for this task, we're needing to explode a moment. So that means that we need to include some sentences talking about what Ruby is thinking, what she is feeling, what she is doing, what she wants to do, and maybe what she understands or doesn't understand. So as we are organizing our scape chart into sentences, we also need to explode this moment. We need to talk about what Ruby is thinking and what she is feeling. So we can use sentence starters like, I think blank. I feel scared, but brave. I want to pray for these people for forgiveness. I don't understand why they are mean to me. I think that things could get worse. Those are examples of sentences that we can add to writing this event to explode it, to give our reader and listener a better understanding of Ruby thinking and feeling in this event. So in the puzzle, I want you to give me an example of a sentence that you are going to use to explode this moment. Go ahead and write your sentence. All right, Smarties, and we are going to wrap up this lesson with a deep dive. So we are going to be talking about experimenting with sentence variety. So as you see on the screen, this is not a complete sentence yet. So I am actually going to go back to my home screen because I'm going to be moving these things around. So we can arrange phrases in a sentence in different ways to make new sentences and to make our writing more interesting. So for example, we could say Ruby walked confidently with her head held high into school. That could be a sentence. Ruby walked confidently with her head held high into school. I can also change this around. I could say confidently, with her head held high, Ruby walked into the school. That's another way I could arrange those phrases to make a new sentence. I could also say, with her head held high, Ruby walked into school confidently. I use those same words, those same phrases in different ways to make my sentence more interesting. So let's look at how we can do that with another sentence. So we have calmly, she stood, howling people facing. So we could say, she stood calmly facing the howling people. She stood calmly facing the howling people. But we could arrange these phrases to make a new sentence. So we could say, facing the howling people, facing the howling people, she stood calmly. Facing the howling people, she stood calmly. That is another way we can arrange those phrases to make it interesting. We could also say, we could say calmly, she stood facing the howling people. So there are different ways, Smarties, that we can arrange phrases in sentences to make our reading more interesting and not to be robotic. So in the Ed Puzzle, I want you to use these phrases to make a sentence. So here are our phrases. Calmly, she stood facing the howling people. I want you to write a complete sentence. So start with an uppercase letter and end with punctuation. All right, Smarties, that is it for today's lesson. Remember, when we are reading text out loud, when we are reading dialogues or those conversations between characters, to change your voice so you know who is talking during the conversation. It makes it more interesting and it helps your listener and reader know who is talking. All right, Smarties, that is it. Keep a growth mindset. Good learners do hard things, and I will see you tomorrow with another lesson. Happy learning, Smarties.